This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Russell Lansbury, and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 30th of November 2021. Welcome, Russell.
Thank you, Judy.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from originally, and a bit about your family background?
Sure. Well, I was born in Victoria, in Melbourne, and I grew up in a family that was not really so involved in industrial relations, although I had an uncle who was my father's only brother, who was in fact a deputy registrar, federal deputy registrar. Frank Lansbury was his name, and he later became a commissioner just towards the end of his life. But to be honest, I really didn't talk to him very much about industrial relations. It wasn't something that I ever contemplated. But I do remember him talking about trade union leaders and how he was a pretty conservative fellow, but he told me how he admired J.J. Brown, who was the communist leader of the tram workers union or tramways union in Victoria, and how they exchanged Christmas cards. And I remember thinking, well, that's pretty good, you know, a conservative fellow like my uncle and a radical union leader having a kind of friendship. So that was a kind of early image that I had of industrial relations, that although there was a divide, there was in fact friendship that could occur. And I think that's a kind of image that I still hold very dear and feel it's an important part of industrial relations. That people can be on different sides, but they can actually have respect and even friendship across the divide, so-called.
And what sort of student were you? Were there any subjects you took that you could see leading you to industrial relations?
Well, not really. I went to University of Melbourne on a Victorian government Department of Education studentship, which meant that I was going to become a teacher. And in fact, I majored in psychology because I intended to become an educational psychologist. But I also did Swedish, which led on to a later life, which involved a lot of time in Scandinavia, and also politics or political science, which became my major area of interest. So industrial relations actually didn't really appear even through my studies of political science. And I guess it was really only when I went to Sweden to do a master's degree in comparative politics or comparative political sociology that I really became aware of industrial relations as it was practiced, or as it is practiced, in the Nordic countries. And so, as we might discover as we talk, that has actually been quite a strong influence in the way I see industrial relations.
And what appealed to you about the Nordic system of industrial relations?
Well, I should say I didn't study industrial relations when I went there for a year to the University of Lund, but later I came back to the University of Melbourne and I became a tutor, and I was asked to give a semester of lectures on Swedish politics because somebody didn't turn up who was supposed to talk about Italian politics. So in the course of that, I really delved into the so-called Swedish model that was established in the 1930s, where the unions and the employers basically said, let's have an agreement and let's keep the politics out of this. Let's keep the government to one side, and we'll form a collective agreement, and that will become essentially the way we run industrial relations in a voluntaristic kind of pattern, rather than having a lot of laws and politics involved. Of course, politics is involved because the unions are allied with the Social Democrats, and the employers tend to be on the side of the Conservatives. But it was a system that I still think works very effectively because it's based on a so-called social partnership between the two main groups or interest groups, the employers and the trade unions.
And so was that your first job, tutoring then?
It was actually. I was supposed to be a teacher. I was supposed to become an educational psychologist and work in schools. But for some strange reason, the education department let me work off my time, if you like, within a university. And I had to do 3 years, and the first year was as a tutor. Then I got a scholarship to Britain, and I came back to Monash, where I finished my next 2 years of teaching. And fortunately, again, it let me into industrial relations because I kind of was an understudy or mentored by the wonderful Joe Isaac, late Joe Isaac, and Di Yerbury, who were the main people teaching industrial relations at Monash when I joined them. And they left after a year, Joe to the Commission, Di to the Federal Department in charge of wage policy, and I sort of eventually took over their courses. So that kind of really got me firmly involved in industrial relations, and indeed the Industrial Relations Society of Victoria.
So what interested you about industrial relations?
Well, look, I think it's I see industrial relations as a very broad field. Clearly there's labour law and there's labour economics, but there's also psychological and social, or even like behavioural aspects of industrial relations. And I think it encompasses all of the social sciences, which have basically been my life, been my career in the social sciences. And I think of industrial relations as a field of applied social science. But of course, it has a very particular kind of approach. And I think that's what attracts me to it, that it's very much about the so-called real world, although I think that's an odd term to use, but it is about people who are practicing industrial relations from an advocate's point of view, from a commissioner or a mediation or arbitration point of view, as well as those representing particular interests. And so I've always found the notion of how you can resolve differences between the parties as being the core of industrial relations, but I think industrial relations has a much broader impact on the society in which we live, on the political system that we have, and I guess our industrial relations system in Australia or Sweden or Britain or the US very much reflects the society in which we operate. So I think it's a great field. I'm going to just have a glass of water.
And so what happened with your academic career from Monash?
Well, from Monash, I went to Macquarie University, and that was because they offered me an associate professorship, and they were also very interested in having somebody in industrial relations, and it happened to be right at the time of Bob Hawke. The Hawke government came into being when I was there, and with the support of the director, we established a labour management studies program, or it was actually called a foundation, which Ed Davis actually continued and expanded after me, but we set it up with the support of particularly the New South Wales Labour Council, the employers, individual employers as well as employers associations. The MTIA, or Australian Industry Group, was very important. And in fact, Cliff Dolan, who was the president of the ACTU after Bob Hawke, became the foundation chair of the program. And we ran a series of annual conferences and some, I guess, continuing education programs for people, as well as it fed into the MBA program, where we established industrial relations as a compulsory core of the MBA. And then I was offered a job 6 years later at University of Sydney, which of course was where industrial relations was founded in the state of New South Wales. And in some ways, although the Victorians would disagree with this, I think the founding father of the Industrial Relations Society, Kingsley Laffer, was in fact the person who established industrial relations as a field of study at Sydney University. And with the support of people like Joe Isaac and Keith Hancock, it was the really beginning of industrial relations education, and indeed, of course, the foundation of the Journal of Industrial Relations, which I think is the second oldest industrial relations journal in the world, I think. And so that's how I came to finish my career, or I guess the largest part of my career, more than 20-something years at University of Sydney, and I've continued to be involved for the 10 years or so since I retired.
What can you tell me about Kingsley Laffer?
Well, I met him towards the end of his life when he had retired. There'd been two interim professors, but neither of them stayed very long. Both were English, one from Oxford, one from Cambridge, and they just kind of stayed for a couple of years. And then George Strauss from the University of California, Berkeley. So I guess I was the substantive replacement for Kingsley on a permanent basis. And we had a very amicable relationship. We established the Kingsley Laffer Library, the Kingsley Laffer Lecture, and sadly he died just a few months before his fellow West Australian and fellow graduate of the University of Western Australia, Bob Hawke, delivered the inaugural Kingsley Laffer Lecture. And we established the Australian Centre for Industrial Relations Research and Teaching with a federal government grant for 9 years, which then continued another 10 or 15 years. And and Kingsley was around for the establishment of that, and we brought in we established a little library within the centre, which became quite a major depository, if you like, of research activity, research volumes, and in fact the initial collection of enterprise bargaining agreements called the Australian Data Management Bank, and that was in the Kingsley Laffer Memorial Lecture. So Kingsley's legacy lives on, and he was a real pioneer. He really established the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales, and some would argue which was in fact a national association, and through his good connections with people like Joe Isaac and Keith Hancock and others, that he saw the association spread to other states. But as Joe once said to me, his real reason for wanting to have an Industrial Relations Society was to establish a journal. And as I said, it is regarded as the second oldest journal after the Cornell Journal in the United States. It preceded the British Journal of Industrial Relations and many other journals in other parts of the world. So I was lucky enough to spend a year or two, I guess, with Kingsley. He invited me along to talk to his Rotary Club, and I remember him asking me to come to his home. His wife sadly had died, and he wanted to donate all his books to the Laffer Library, which we did. So I was very fortunate to have that time with him.
Can you describe how the society was founded as a national body, and then how each of the state associations started up?
Yes, well, I was asked to do this maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago for a meeting of the National Executive who were interested to know, and maybe this was the genesis of the current project that you're doing, because people were uncertain about, when one society started and the other. But again, my understanding, and this is, I guess, based on some documentary evidence, but also my discussions with people like Joe Isaac, Keith Hancock, and of course Kingsley Laffer, was that Laffer had gone to the United States. He'd seen what the American Society had done. It was established after the Second World War. It's now called LERA, the Labor and Employment Relations Association in the United States, and it was very much a tripartite organization, but one which has a very strong academic role. In fact, it was called the Research Association initially, the Industrial Relations Research Association, but it has chapters all over the United States like we do in Australia. And Laffer saw this as a kind of model, I think, as I said, for getting a journal established and for also promoting industrial relations as a field of study, because it was really, well, it's had stops and starts at various times. In the University of Melbourne, it started and then it stopped, and Bill Ford at University of New South Wales also got things going, but Laffer started industrial relations as a subject in the early 1950s, and it took him about a couple of decades to actually get industrial relations recognised as a department at the University of Sydney in the Faculty of Economics. And that really kicked off departments in other universities, West Australia. Well, West Australia really, I think, was probably the second or third. Eventually, in the 70s, we had the re-establishment of a department at the University of Melbourne, and so on. So I think Laffer's dream was actually to see what we have now, although we'd have to admit that departments have declined as a result of industrial relations as a field declining, academic field, and in some ways a practitioner field, with the demise of unions or decline of unionization. I guess the changing role of what is now the Fair Work Commission. So I guess I was lucky, as was John Nyland, who preceded me at the University of New South Wales, to see an enormous expansion of industrial relations in the 80s and 90s. And John and I were reminiscing the other day that towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, first year industrial relations at both New South Wales and Sydney had over 1,000 students. We were running parallel courses, and that fed into master's degrees and PhDs and so on, which still exist, but are not of the same, well, they're not as large in terms of attracting students as it once was.
But in terms of the society, it started as a national organisation in Sydney, is that right?
That's my understanding. They just called it the Industrial Relations Society. And then later, I think the notion of Industrial Relations Society of Victoria, South Australia, and then New South Wales was formed, and they then had they formed a national body, but the national body was always fairly weak. It was just a kind of meeting place, as I understood it. And New South Wales actually retained a kind of dominant role, which has probably declined now, and well and good, I guess. But it was where the journal was always produced until this well, it still is produced in New South Wales between University of New South Wales and University of Sydney. So it was a gradual evolution. Kingsley told me that to get it established, he had to really get the practitioners involved, and one of the people he really wanted to get involved was John Kerr, John Kerr, who later became Sir John Kerr, who was reluctant to join apparently, but once they offered him the presidency, he became much more interested, and so he was one of the early movers and shakers, and there were people on the trade union side, particularly the Labour Council of New South Wales was very deeply involved in the society. And so, you know, the notion was that you would have a rotation between unions, employers, government officials from the departments of industrial relations, and or commissioners, and deputy presidents, and also academics. So a kind of quadripartite, I guess, 4 different groups being involved. And that's still the notion, particularly at the national level, that, and yet then you have to add the states all having a turn at having the presidency. But perhaps I should all just add, if we don't get to say this, that a very important role that Laffer had in mind was that we should have the Australian industrial relations community should have a role in the international industrial relations community. So he was also involved in the establishment of what was called the International Industrial Relations Association. John Nyland, of course, became the first president of that association. Now it's called the International Labour and Employment Relations Association. And my good colleague, Ray Cooper, will be the third Australian to be, and the first woman to, not from the first woman from Australia, but the third woman to be the international president. And you know, that's been a great opportunity for Australians to be involved in the initial International Association meeting or World Congress that was held in 1992, presided over by John Nyland. There was about 1,000 people attended, about 50-50 from Australia and international, and the same was true in 2009, and I hope it will be also in 2027. Will also attract similar numbers from Australia and internationally. So I think that's the other thing I should have added about LAFA, that he wanted to see Australians and the Australian system of industrial relations given a lot more attention at the international level, because he believed that we had a unique system that had many good things about it that should be shared around the world.
There's obviously been a lot of major changes in industrial relations in recent decades. How do you think that's reflected through the society and the way it operates?
Well, look, I think sadly the society is numerically not what it once was. That, I guess, is a reflection of many different things. I think it reflects the fact that there's been the rise of human resource management, which was in the 70s, early 70s, when I first came back to Australia, a fairly minor field compared to industrial relations. And that was true also in the United Kingdom, where I did my PhD. And in fact, I did it with a professor of human resource management. But you know, I remember him saying, it will never be as important as industrial relations. So that's one factor. And I think that that's an area we need to strengthen in terms of our bringing human resource people into industrial relations association. It's also, of course, a reflection of the fact that unions have declined, and that's not just in Australia. Unionisation has declined in most countries, not all countries, but many of the Western countries. And again, you know, that's a reflection of a whole range of different things. And I guess the institutions in Australia, the Industrial Relations Commission, which was called, of course, the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, was at its height when we had a highly centralised system, and when we had state systems as well. And I guess since John Howard managed to convince the High Court that the industrial relations institutions should be brought under the corporation's power, which meant that the state systems would eventually disappear, except for public servants, state public servants, and where the whole, I guess, raison d'etre of the way industrial relations is managed, conducted, would fall under the corporation's power rather than the industrial power of the Constitution. And without getting into kind of complex issues, that has undoubtedly had an influence on the decline, I think, of the industrial relations institutions, both state and federal.
What do you think the Industrial Relations Society has to offer potential members? Why would you join today?
Well, we tell our students, join the Industrial Relations Society because it gives you an opportunity to meet with the participants, the employers, the unions, though people from the tribunals, as well as other students and academics. And I think it's a unique body. The other bodies, like the Human Resource Association, which of course has an important role to play, does not have a tripartite approach. as we do in the Industrial Relations Society. I'd like to call it a social partnership approach, where the parties can meet, and this is always, I think, a distinction of the Industrial Relations Society, and still remains so, that people involved in the practice of industrial relations can meet together and discuss matters without, having to take sides. And I think another very important reason for people to join is that it still is the association that produces the Journal of Industrial Relations, which has a very high profile internationally as well as nationally. It is an authoritative source, particularly the annual review of industrial relations, which now is accompanied by a conference and really is the place to go if you want to find out what's really happening from different perspectives, from the employer perspectives, the union perspectives, the legal perspectives, the human resource perspectives. It's a very encompassing opportunity for people to learn. And of course, as a student, you also get your journal 5 times a year. So that's another very good reason for people to join, to get access to the journal.
And what do you think makes industrial relations a good career for a young person today?
Well, despite there's fewer jobs than there once was, there are still lots of jobs. There are a lot of people advertise. I look at various sources and see jobs being advertised. I know that we still at University of Sydney and other places have employers, unions and government organisations that provide work experience for our students. So there are jobs out there, and it's an opportunity, it's a field in which you don't have to always be, if you like, on the one side. Jeff Judicher, who sadly died recently, was someone who started his career working for a union and then worked for employers, and then of course presided over the Fair Work Commission. And so he would be an example of someone who has worked on, say, both sides, if you like, of the fence, as well as being in the middle, being the arbitrator. So it's a very rich field for a young person to go into and have the opportunity to work in a variety of roles at the corporate level, at the union level, at the government level, and of course at the tribunal level. So it's quite a unique opportunity for people who want to really, I think, explore all the different elements in the Australian political and industrial life, because it combines political, economic, social, and other aspects. It really is a kaleidoscope of activity, I think, for which I think many people would be very pleased to experience.
That's great, Russell. I think we're just about out of time. Is there anything that I haven't raised that you'd like to talk about?
Not really. I think you've done a great job, and I hope that I haven't contradicted too many other people. But maybe that's one of the interesting things, that we, we're not all singing from the same hymn sheet. There's still room for a lot of interpretation of what goes on. But look, I guess I am still very optimistic about the future of our field, and perhaps I should mention that there is an academic group, the Academic Industrial Relations Association, which meets every year, usually attracts 150 people, but they don't all come from industrial relations. They come from history, politics, law, sociology, and meet and discuss industrial relations issues, or issues to do with work and organisational studies, which is the name that we give ourselves at University of Sydney. There's also, of course, Labour Lawyers Group, there's an academic association for labour, or people involved in labour law. So I like to think of the Industrial Relations Society as a place that brings all these different groups together. But I guess we have to recognise that there are different needs that different people have, and it's good that we have a range of different organisations, but I would like to see the Industrial Relations Society grow, and I have a sense that there is a kind of rebound in the association, and perhaps projects like yours can help promote that.
That's great. Thanks so much, Russell.
Pleasure.